And now we have Absol. The master of predicting disaster has been one of the coolest Pokemon since it first lurked in the grass east of Fortree City. Absol isn't a fancy standout Pokemon, but it genuinely doesn't care, which makes it even cooler and a little bit edgy. Even its name origin is cool. It consists of the Latin terms for away from and sun, which could refer to a solar eclipse, which used to be considered a sign of impending disaster, thus reflecting what Absol is all about. Today we'll see if Absol's cool factor translated to competitive success. So, how good was Absol actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. 130 attack and Swords Dance looks promising, but Absol has no physical stab, a shallow physical move pool, unremarkable speed, and non-existent defensive utility, between a lack of resistances and terrible bulk. So it had the terrible combination of struggling to switch in to begin with, then being unable to do any notable damage whatsoever afterwards. It was completely outclassed by every physical attacker by a significant margin, and no one tried to get cute with baton passing Swords Dances or Calm Minds because the vastly superior Celebi existed. As such, Absol dropped to UU, and unfortunately its lack of bulk, resistances, and speed meant it struggled against so much of the tier that it had to really make the most out of the rare occasion it'd be able to switch in, because it wouldn't be able to do so again. Thus, if it was going to contribute anything relevant, it had to put aside any notions of hitting and running with Choice Band or using Swords Dance boost for itself, and went all in on baton passing. With a set of substitute, Swords Dance, Taunt, and baton pass while holding a Select Berry, it was well equipped at accomplishing something relevant with its pass. Absol was best switched in on the same turn its user was expecting a switch from something not too immediately threatening, such as Blastoise or Gligar. It was also a good switch into Hypno and Grumpig. From there, it could safely get off a Swords Dance, provided the opposing team wasn't too fast. If it felt something dangerous with higher speed was coming in, such as Pinsir or Scyther, Substitute would at worst allow Absol's teammate to come in safely. At best, it could substitute down to Select range in the face of repeated attacks, allowing it to Swords Dance while faster, and then pass +2 attack and +1 speed, which made Pokemon like Kangaskhan incredibly dangerous, potentially ending games right then and there. Taunt prevented moves that could mess up the pass, such as Roar, Haze, Encore, or opposing Taunt. Of course, this strategy was not guaranteed to work even if the pass was pulled off, which was already fairly difficult to ensure, and Absol had a nasty tendency to wind up as dead weight. Most UU players favored more reliable, less risky strategies, meaning Absol was seen once in a blue moon by the most experienced players looking to experiment with lesser used Pokemon, like Absol, to see if they could get semi-consistent use out of them, before concluding most of them were not used for a reason, and this included Absol. Sadly, Absol's debut generation was entirely forgettable for the disaster prophet Pokemon. The 4th generation's change to the physical and special split was exactly what Absol needed. It was still far too frail and slow to make any impact in OU, but it now had the tools to become a top tier in UU. It could finally fire off the stab it had previously so sorely missed from its superior attack stat. Night Slash and its high critical hit ratio were good, especially with Absol's terrific new Super Luck ability. Even better was the amazing new Sucker Punch, which coming from Absol was the strongest priority move in the game, given its stab and monstrous attack, and this helped circumvent the issue of Absol's unflattering speed. Also, improved upon Platinum's release was Absol's non-stab physical move pool with the addition of Superpower. Not only was it particularly useful for trouncing the troublesome Registeel, Steelix, and Rhyperior, but Dark and Fighting's collective coverage was so solid that Absol could easily complement Sucker Punch's riskier nature with the more reliable Night Slash against bulky users of Will-O-Wisp like Spiritomb and Rotom. However, it could also go with Psycho Cut to improve its coverage against fighting types that threatened it, notably Hitmontop and Toxicroak, with the latter being one of the few Pokemon that resisted both Dark and Fighting. The noticeably stronger hit on the prominent physical wall Weezing didn't hurt either. And while it could easily make great use of Lumberry to shrug off the tier's various Will-O-Wisps, Thunderwave, Toxics, and Sleep Powders, Absol generally favored Gen 4's new Life Orb, which gave it the power boost it so craved, while still being able to switch moves, allowing it to fully embrace its role of wall breaker by maximizing its damage output each time it hit the field. Speaking of, Absol still wasn't switching into battle at will, but it certainly had a much easier time finding ways to get in to start dishing out damage. Uxie and Mesprit were common stealth rock setters that invited a free Absol switch with use of both rocks and their staff Psychic, while Absol could also grab a switch against Registeel, Chansey, and Clefable, going for rocks, as well as the latter two using Soft Boil. Plus, even in games where Absol didn't come in as easily, once it did manage to come in, such as on a double switch or after after a teammate went down, it was easily able to dish out severe damage against both offense and defense. Sucker Punch ripped through the many faster, frailer Pokemon in the tier, even crushing resists like Blaziken. This quality was especially useful for keeping frailer Swift Swimmers in check, and that was huge given the penchant Rain teams had for giving the offensive teams Absol was a part of major trouble. On the other side of the spectrum, bulky cores were absolutely destroyed by its Swords Dance boosted assault, which it easily grabbed on one of the aforementioned fighting weak walls that faced the prospect of crumpling to superpower for free and having its team get run over by the Pokemon it was supposed to keep in check. For this reason, Absol was one of the most dangerous Pokemon for otherwise powerful stall teams to face. Its reliability in dishing out relevant damage allowed it to play a key role in just about every game. It was so impossible to safely counter that it consistently leave all kinds of teams without important Pokemon, which would allow for easy capitalization by its own teammates. It wasn't exactly easy to use, but Absol was one of the most ferocious Pokemon in DPP UU and took up a unique, highly feared mantle within the tier. OU was definitely several steps above Absol's Pokepay grade in Gen 5, and sadly, so was UU this time around, with the tier resembling the previous generation's OU that had also been too much for Absol. Thus, it dropped to the new RU, which was similar to the previous generation's UU, and as such, Absol was once more a top tier Pokemon. The tried and true Swords Dance set functioned identically to the previous generation, blowing through bulky teams while picking off would-be revenge killers such as Moltres and Aerodactyl with Sucker Punch, which also gave it excellent utility in checking dangerous setup sweepers such as Unburdened Sceptile and Shell Smash Omastar. However, Absol soon started experimenting with its movesets a little more, and those small changes expanded its palette of capability greatly. Its strength made it capable of breaking non-full stall teams quite easily without needing a boost, and it rarely was able to fully sweep offensive teams thanks to the prominence of powerful anti-Sucker Punch measures such as Durant, Scarf Embor, and Choice Band Entei with extreme speed, meaning Absol was usually better off hitting and running. So by dropping Swords Dance for Fire Blast, the improved coverage that let it roast major metagame targets that usually stood in its way, like Tangrowth, Escavalier, and Steelix, in addition to potentially catching a Durant switch, meant it was able to significantly improve its amount of one-on-one matchups, and thus give itself far more opportunities to dish out high amounts of damage against the greater metagame, which consisted mostly of bulky offense and balanced teams, making it more consistent on a game-to-game basis. Absol could also effectively use Pursuit in its fourth move slot. This meant it was useful by virtue of being able to trap an important dark weak target such as Uxie, Mesprit, Slowking, and Rotom, even if the opponent had a Pokemon like Alomomola or Intimidate Qwilfish that would wall non-Swords Dance Absol. This meant Absol's teammates troubled by these Pokemon such as Gallade and Medicham were a lot more dangerous. Overall, Absol wasn't a high-profile metagame superstar, but its immense strength was as effective as ever at forcing severe damage on the opponent, and with minor moveset variations, it now had a few degrees of nuance of its game that made it significantly more difficult to deal with, as well as more of an effective team player. The 6th generation brought many notable changes for Absol. Steel types no longer resisted its dark stabs, and instead of Night Slash, it now wielded a massively buffed knockoff. However, it gained new nemesis in the form of dark and fighting resistant fairy types. The biggest change though was its gift from Arceus in the form of a Mega Evolution, which provided it with an incredibly crucial speed boost, as well as giving it the special attack stat to potentially abuse the Ice Beam and Fire Blast in its move pool, and one of the best abilities in the game, Magic Bounce. It was still far too frail to attempt much hazard blocking, but Status and Leech Seed were no longer viable countermeasures to its offensive onslaught. It also got access to Play Rough, allowing it to mow fighting types down. Absol could even use Knockoff's widespread popularity to its advantage pre-Mega, as it could take a hit and gain +1 attack from Justified, while not losing its item, and even taking weaker knockoff damage. While it did see some OU usage early in the generation as a result of people experimenting with the new Megas, it unfortunately couldn't keep up at all thanks to its miserable matchup against the metagame, between its lack of bulk and resistances as well as low speed before Mega evolving, which meant instead of threatening Keldeo with Play Rough, it had to switch out. It was also unable to pack all the coverage it needed into its moveset. It had the necessities of Knockoff and Sucker Punch, but then had to cram in Superpower for Tyranitar, Heatran, and Ferrothorn, but wanted Iron Tail for Clefable, Ice Beam for Gliscor and Landorus Therian, and Play Rough for Keldeo. That's not even mentioning Fire Fire Blast and Swords Dance. Thanks to these flaws, it dropped to UU, and it still had issues there. Its moveset would never be without missing coverage, given the popularity of bulky fairy and fighting types like Florges and Chestnut respectively. It still struggled to switch in consistently, and faced severe competition from fellow Mega Pokemon that did not have this issue, like Aerodactyl and Aggron. The latter was also incredibly good at neutering Absol's offensive threat, thanks to ludicrous bulk and filter weakening superpower. It was difficult to fit Absol on a team given its minimal synergy, and as a result it dropped to RU. But it didn't last long down there because it absolutely destroyed the tier, which was not equipped to handle it at all, and was quickly banned to RU-BL. Absol had some use in UU, such as packing a brutally powerful stab pursuit for Bronzong, which Aerodactyl wanted absolutely no part of, while still being able to trap Celebi and Chandelure like Arrow could. Being able to trap Bronzong was unique and potentially huge for helping Pokemon who were usually stopped by it to become threatening. However, Absol offered little beyond this, and Megas were generally expected to provide more, which is why Aerodactyl was usually preferred. It was able to consistently accomplish far more and cover a much greater portion of the metagame, thanks to superior typing and speed, while generally being more of a threat on offense, despite the Stealth Rock. The tragedy of Mega Absol was not being quite good enough to be more than niche, and still usually outclassed in UU, but being far too powerful for RU. Even Megas have it tough sometimes. As for regular Absol, it found itself in RU once again. It was a vicious wall breaker with Knockoff and Sucker Punch alone, but it struggled to fit all the coverage it needed to cover the more expansive metagame. It wanted all Superpower, Play Rough, Iron Tail, and Fire Blast to bypass its various answers, which were all common and important Pokemon. The speed and bulk of the metagame meant brute forcing its way through with Swords Dance was as inconsistent as hoping it had the right coverage combination for any given specific matchup. However, Absol could increase its consistency by playing to its strengths rather than trying to focus on what the opponent had. It did this by using Pursuit. Trapping the many dark weak Pokemon in the metagame such as Meloetta and Slowking maximized the value Absol got out of its good matchups regardless of what Pokemon the opponent had to deal with, guaranteeing that Absol would do something of concrete use that its teammates could take advantage of. It could also soften the opponent's team post-pursuit with Knockoff, removing potentially crucial leftovers, which could also be the crack in the opponent's defenses that led to them succumbing to Absol's teammates' offense. It was rare for Absol to brutalize any and all switch-ins. It just couldn't do that consistently, given the variety of moves that task required. Although it could still be scary on occasion, it was more consistent and solid at opening a specific hole in the opposing team, functioning as a crucial, powerful offensive utility Pokemon. Mega Absol was not a good Pokemon in VGC 2014. Between the comparatively low power of its stabs and its lack of widespread super effective coverage, it was not able to threaten the one-hit KOs it needed to justify its obscure frailty, as well as its occupation of the Mega slot, which was highly contested by amazing Pokemon such as Kangaskhan, Charizard, Mawile, and more. Amazingly, Ashton Cox managed to reach an impressive 13th at the Virginia Regionals using Absol with Feint to break Protect, so very well done to him for that otherwise unthinkable feat. Then in 2015, even more Megas came around, including the amazing Mega Salamence, so Absol probably wasn't even thought about, Mega or no Mega, especially as Mence was faster than Absol's impressive 115 speed. Except for by Jake Huang Twig, who en route to a top cut appearance at Seattle Regionals, utilized an inventive Mega Absol with defensive investment and foul play to use its opponent's high attack stats against them, especially Mega Metagross, while also packing Ice Beam for Landorus T and Mega Salamence and Superpower for Heatran, Terrakion, and Mega Kangaskhan. However, even Jake admitted that while it was good in testing, this Pokemon was extraordinarily flawed in a real tournament setting and saw nearly no usage in its top cut appearance. It wasn't the most glorious appearance for Absol, but it was something. The immediate Mega Speed stat mechanic of Gen 7 worked in Absol's favor, but it definitely didn't appreciate Sucker Punch being nerfed to 70 base power. However, even without that nerf, it wouldn't have been enough to change where it ended up, which was basically the same arc as Gen 6. Its non-usage in the fairy-laden OU dropped it to UU, where it was outclassed and sent it down to RU for the briefest of spells before it was sent to RU-BL for being absurdly overwhelming in the tier, leaving it in the limbo of not being really usable at the highest level of UU, but with nowhere else to go as a consequence of not being used. It was the same sad story in UU. It lacked the bulk or resistances to switch in. Its coverage was riddled with imperfections that significantly limited its ability to consistently deal damage, and as a Mega, it faced severe competition with other Megas that were far better Pokemon overall, mainly Aerodactyl. UU's addition of Scizor, Bisharp, and Alolan Muck, all generally good Pokemon against the overall metagame, meant Absol couldn't even carve out a niche as a pursuiter, with an edge over Mega Aerodactyl and Crocodile for its ability to be immediately threatening to Z-move Latias. They also weren't nearly as vulnerable to the powerful Primarina. Sadly, there was just no way to use Mega Absol without it being notably outclassed. So, c'est la vie. As for regular Absol, it plummeted to PU. Knockoff removing Eviolites from common switch-ins like Tangela and Girder was useful, but it was pretty tough for Absol to switch in enough to make use of that. It was a Pokemon that thrived on dishing immediate damage, not playing the long game. And Pokemon like these, as well as others that prevented Absol from ripping teams apart, such as Mudsdale and Silvally Fairy, were so common that it was just too difficult for Absol to consistently get anything going. It could be threatening on occasion, but it was generally not a Pokemon players need to explicitly concern themselves with. And that's it. So how good was Absol actually? Well, it's never been able to leave even the slightest impact on OU. It was able to pose a severe threat in the lower tiers for a few generations, but eventually the terrible 3 of extreme frailty, lack of resistances, and low speed caught up with it. Its powerful Sucker Punch couldn't fix everything. Even its Mega Form was unable to find success outside of the lower tiers it was blatantly too strong for, because it was just so bad defensively. Absol just hasn't been given a tool set well-rounded enough for success. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False White Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Absol? Would you give it more bulk so it would be more viable, or really, what would you give it to make it more viable? Whatever it is, let me know. And of course, shout outs to the patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.